watching Daily Scoop. Today is February 24th. If you recall, 2 years ago on this exact day, King Louis Philippe abdicated the French throne. Today we have prepared a special segment that highlights what happened across Europe in the past 2 years, focusing on the revolutions that took place across European countries such as Austria, Prussia, Italy, and France, beginning around 1848. These revolutions were made up of several protests led by the liberal working class. But before we get into this, here's Dominique with some information about the Congress of Vienna, which happened several decades prior.
Thank you, Amal. Now let's take a look at the Congress of Vienna and the Conservative Reformation. The Congress of Vienna was a meeting held between the 5 great powers of Europe. This included France, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain. Its ultimate goal was to build a stable diplomatic order following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. It took place from 1814 to 1815 and included 3 major principles that were essentially the guidelines of all the negotiations and deliberations that took place during this Congress. The first principle dealt with issues of legitimacy. Monarchs that had been previously removed were then reinstated, and power remained at the hands of conservative interests. This included monarchy, aristocracy, and the church. The second principle dealt with issues of compensation. Nations which had lost territory in one area received compensation by being given another territory in a different area. The final principle and key focus of the Congress's discussions was the issue regarding balance of power. To resolve this issue, the Congress came to the conclusion of establishing something known as buffer states. These buffer states were meant to quarantine France should another revolution break out. While these principles served as guidelines for the goals of the Congress, each nation had its own goals in mind when coming into the Congress of Vienna. Austria's main goal was to repress nationalism while building a collective system of security to maintain its existing state of affairs. France's goal was to be readmitted into the family of great powers by demonstrating its return to legitimacy. Britain saw the Congress as a way to achieve its goal in reestablishing the continent's balance of power, and Prussia's goal was to incorporate its enemy, Saxony, into its territory. Russia wanted to gain control of Poland while also gaining support for something called the Holy Alliance of Powers. Basically, this was a committee that was committed to stopping godless revolutions. Some of the key leaders of the Congress of Vienna were Helms von Metternich, Talleyrand, Lord Castlereagh, Prince von Hardenberg, and Alexander I. These great powers formed an alliance known as the Quintuple Alliance in order to ensure peace and stability, formerly known as the Quadruple Alliance until France joined in. They also agreed to meet periodically to discuss issues of concern, especially revolutions and wars. However, throughout the period of 1815 through 1848, a man named Metternich devoted himself to creating a series of anti-revolutionary alliances throughout Europe. This, coupled along with the peace settlement reached by the Congress of Vienna, based on conservative ideals shared by other members of the Congress, played a role in the restoration of conservatism. The Congress's re-establishment of its 3 principles and suppression of liberal uprisings aimed at reinstating the political and social order that existed before the revolution. Essentially, they aimed to restore conservatism and diminish the liberal sentiment. However, after the revolutions of 1848, conservative factions dealt with successive blows and either lost power to liberals and nationalists or clung to power through coalitions.
Before we dive into the effects of the revolutions in 1848, it's important to know the ideologies that influenced the way people lived and those of which were created to reject ideas valued during the Enlightenment, as well as new forms of government that were created as the era of industrialization grew. These were known as Romanticism, Liberalism, and Socialism. Liberalism was the idea that influenced the French Revolution. Liberalists are typically open to change, promote reforms, are religiously tolerant, and want individual rights. All ideas inspired from the Enlightenment. However, Romanticism, which developed 25 years after Napoleon's reign, completely rejected ideas from the Enlightenment. It was based on one's perception and individual thought rather than reason. It also served as a form of nostalgia for medieval times. Lastly, socialism developed as a backlash to individualism and focused on economic planning, greater social equality, and state regulation of property. Early socialists had a desire to help those who were poor and wanted to build a sense of community. Although ultimately failing by the 1850s, their ideals remained inspirational for future reformers. Karl Marx was one of these reformers. He created the idea of Marxist socialism, which he believed was more developed because it was based on historic law. In terms of France, he described the nobles as those who were wealthy and owned the factories, exploiting the workers. He believed that as the workers grew poorer, they would eventually overthrow the nobles and end the class struggle and establish a system of radical equality, otherwise known as communism. But that's a topic for next time.
Revolutions across Europe have caused widespread chaos. Countries such as Italy, Austria, Prussia, and of course the epicenter, France, have experienced uprisings among the liberal working class. Due to new machinery, such as the sewing machine and the cotton gin, unemployment rates were through the roof. These machines led to the replacement of workers. Without their jobs, our working force was desperate to make a living. They were unfortunately losing their homes as well. The rise in prices has caused numerous small farmers to go out of business, which has led to less entrepreneurship, leading to the expansion of already established factories. Our population across the continent has grown exponentially, and food production has not kept up with our advancements. Our people were starving, and not enough food was growing. Prices for bread and other basic necessities have risen substantially. Wages stayed the same, and riots were sparking throughout. People have resorted to violence, but this is only because the government refuses to do what's right for our people. King Louis Philippe refused to reform the government in favor of the working class. Due to the lack of reform, people started to rebel against him. Now, let's take a look at what the revolutions look like in other countries. Here's Dominique.
Thank you, Amal. Now, when we stop and take a look at what happened in Austria around the period of 1848, we can see that the main trigger for the outbursts of Austrian revolutions can be traced back to the rebellion of liberal workers, the middle class, and students in Vienna throughout the month of March. This revolution ended up forcing Prince Metternich to flee Britain. Some of the main leaders of the revolutions in Austria were known as Clemens von Metternich, who was a conservative foreign minister, as well as Franz Joseph I, who became the emperor after his uncle was abdicated. The Austrian revolutions, however, didn't see many positive results, as the Austrian army was able to successfully isolate and shut down each of these revolts, and then place Franz Joseph I back into power as their emperor. He continued to enforce Austrian dominance over other European minorities. Although we know these revolutions ended in bitter disappointment and for the most part forcefully suppressed, some good did come out of these revolutions. Austria, as of last year, has abolished serfdom all throughout its empire, and Franz Joseph I, our current emperor, has agreed to a constitutional monarchy. Now back to you.
Thank you. We're here in Frankfurt, Prussia, where German nationalists met together as the Frankfurt Assembly, hoping to make a constitutional and independent state of Germany after suffering from starvation and severe unemployment rates. They met just here in the Church of St. Paul, where the Assembly tried to work out issues like divisions of land, a proper ruler, and a just constitution. Some argued for who would be the rightful leader, the previous rulers of the Holy Roman Empire residing in Austria, or someone from Prussia. On December of 1848, they had the Declaration of Rights of the German People, where they attempted to hand leadership to Frederick William IV. He denied this position even after siding with making a new Germany previously, all because he didn't want to lose power with a constitutional monarchy or a very probable war with Austria. After this rejection, all hopes were lost for Germany, and the revolution sadly failed.
Thank you for updating France. Tonight we're here in Sicily, Italy, where there have been many conflicts against Austrian rule. A lot of events occurred, including the Pope getting expelled from Rome and the Austrian army defeating Italy in their most recent war. It wasn't looking too good for us. Although these events are unfortunate, Italy does eventually have a couple of victories.
Austria abolished serfdom and a few Italian Habsburg lands. Charles Albert of Piemonte, Sardinia granted a constitution for his people. That's good. Besides the political issues and outcomes, most of Europe was starving. There are people begging for food left and right. Many problems have arisen, including crop failure, and because of this, prices for wheat doubled in France and Italy, which makes it really difficult for people to afford. Besides the fact that half of, most of Europe was starving, we're going through an economic crisis and a huge period of unemployment. All this ultimately led up to the failed revolution.
Thank you, Dominique, Adriana, and Amelie, for the amazing input for providing us with these different perspectives of the revolutions of 1848. Today, we are going to reflect on the problems of the past. If you recall, exactly 2 years ago on this day, the King of France fled the throne. We the people wanted a country without a leader who believed in nepotism. We wished to reduce censorship and have universal suffrage, but King Louis Philippe refused to do so. A couple years back, if you recall, our disgraceful king who abdicated responsibilities, a man clearly unfit for the throne and unfit to rule a beautiful country, which can clearly be seen when he left, leaving his country to perish. King Louis Philippe refused to reform our country for the greater good, almost as if he hated his people, leaving them to fend for themselves, suffering as if almost he wanted them to.
As she was saying, French reformers had set up a banquet campaign in which the liberals desired extended suffrage rights. However, on February 22nd of 1848, unfortunately this campaign was cancelled because the lousy government was scared that their people, specifically our working and middle class, would protest and overthrow them. This decision backfired, however, because the cancelling of the campaign angered people even more. Large numbers of protesters rushed into the streets of Paris and demanded to be heard. After the political banquets had been outlawed, when the people united and revolted against Louis Philippe, fighting broke out between them and law enforcement. Word of this reached the Prime Minister Guizot, making him resign. Again, citizens caught wind of this and went to confront him. It ended with many dead rioters, a frightful, disastrous city, and the amazing king, Louis Philippe, fleeing and stepping down as king. These revolutions ended up with a new provisional Second Republic achieving the goals of a right to work and, of course, men's suffrage.
4 years, the working class had experienced numerous concerns and a strong desire to improve their working conditions. There have been reports of numerous cases of cholera and tuberculosis among workers, both adults and children. The working conditions include heavy smoke, air pollution, and long working hours with heavy machinery. Workers were demanding better work conditions as they worked tediously to earn for their families. Current working conditions have caused many workers to fall ill and suffer in agony. Our workers deserve better working conditions as they should not have to put their lives at risk in order to provide food for their families. It is the government's duty to provide for the health of their people. Since wages are not enough to cover living expenses, children must work long working hours and earn for their family. Young children are being robbed of their childhood when instead they should be playing with toys. They are suffering in horrible working conditions. And now let's move on to Amelie.
So we are here with two struggling, hardworking mothers, and we're going to listen to their struggles And thus, as a woman and a mother, been impacted during the revolution.
Because of these working and living conditions. Oh, God. Oh. My family has gone through so much. You know, my poor husband's arms were mutilated, and so now me and my children have been forced to work. It's been so hard for us.
What would you say your life was like prior to the revolution?
Women work so hard in these factories that don't even have good safety procedures. We are disposable to those who own the factory, like we don't even matter. I barely make enough money for my children. All the machinery in the factories are uncovered, and I often see people get caught in them. It's so frightening. There's so much polluted air, it's hard to breathe properly now.
For starters, let's just establish the fact that I've done more things that benefit my country.
No, you haven't.
Excuse me?
You heard me.
I was chosen to take a leadership role in France's Second Republic. I believe that every man in my beloved country should have a job. Look, I'm a leader, not a follower, like you. What have you done that's so glamorous? Tell me, please.
Okay, I may not have been chosen as the country's second republic, but because of my success while hosting the Congress of Vienna, I've secured a spot as the Chancellor of Austria. You continue to fuel silly liberalist ideas, when in reality, what you need to keep a secure nation is a collective security to keep the tradition and nationalism alive. We should resort to the traditional ways of life, with the monarchies being restored, as it has kept peace for centuries.
Sure it is. I convinced our new government to establish national workshops, which gave opportunities to the unemployed. I just genuinely want to see my country thrive.
We all want to see that happen.
All these people who have been out of work due to these machines have broken families apart. Look, your methods will never compare to mine. The stupid conservative ideas that property should be privately owned is nonsense. Everyone should have access to land and all property should be public. I'm a hero for my country. Please, tell me what you have done. You're not even worthy enough to talk to me.
You really think establishing a few workshops and giving jobs to those who can barely put food on their plate will instantly make your country more successful than mine? These people can barely provide for themselves and you think they're ready to own property? These people need control. Humans are prone to mistakes and are selfish in nature. The last thing they need is someone supporting their nonsense. People like you are the reason the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars are supported. And do you see how it ended for Napoleon, who created idiotic liberal reforms which gave people more freedoms? And what were the ultimate goals of both? To overthrow a perfectly good, functioning government after gaining too many liberal freedoms. Just watch. These people will no longer need you and will get rid of you. People don't need property rights. The more freedoms they're granted, the more they'll want to be.
So bad.
So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about the results and impacts of the revolutions. The revolutions in 1848 didn't necessarily do anything. In fact, it completely failed. Considering the lack of organization or communication, I would have assumed it would fail too. In addition, the liberals of the middle class were scared of the radicalism of the workers, so this caused there to be no long-lasting alliances. Although this was an absolute disaster, there were at least a couple of impacts. For example, it caused many discussions about how weaken the government. This catastrophe and event did absolutely nothing to improve the situation in Europe, so I would say it was a fail.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Hamal Bukhari and this is Daily Scoop. We'll see you tomorrow with more breaking news.